Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. This week, the fascinating world of spirits and magic in the religions of Southeast Asia. Appalachian State's Dr. Cristina Varana Sornito of the Department of Anthropology teaches a popular course called Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion, and has worked among groups that practice what we might consider to be rather unorthodox religious practices. Dr. Sornito, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I want to ask you about your course a little later on, but first I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about this research that you have conducted, and still ongoing research, I think, in the Philippines. We talked a little about it earlier, and I find it fascinating. So if you could maybe give us some outline of the work you're doing there.
Sure. I did my research in the central region of the Philippines called the Western Visayas region. It is between the capital area of Luzon. Luzon is the northernmost island. Most people know it for the capital city, Manila. And the southern region of the Philippines is called Mindanao. So the Visayas sits in the central part of the Philippines. And my research there tracked the following of a group of people in one small town called Santa Barbara, Iloilo. And that following was a group of people that defined themselves by the following of a healer known as Santa Regla.
Santa Regla.
Santa Regla,
and
yes.
She's a local woman who is known as a healer. Is that correct? Or
she was known as Santa Regla, popularly speaking, but she was called that by a lot of people because the Marionite figure that she identified with and claimed to draw her healing powers from was called Santa Regla. The name of the woman who her everyday name was Maria. Maria.
So where do these healing powers come from within this tradition?
Well, in the Philippines, what's popularly known across the world as shamanism or shamans, in the Philippines is broadly known as Baybaylanism. And Baybaylans are healers and spirit guides that, while that's a broad term for it, there are many different iterations of that. And so in this particular instance, Santa Regla, the people that believed in her powers of healing would take on petitions, and these petitions could come in the form of letters or people that would come to her healing center. Now, she had this was during the 1980s, she had a healing center in this town, and people would come mostly on Fridays. Now, Fridays and Tuesdays were considered auspicious days in the Philippines for healers, and she would open her, I guess you could call it a clinic, and receive petitions and receive people who felt they needed the help of a Baybaylan.
Wow. Now, is this particular following of Santa Regla, it's, I guess, a product of cultures coming together and interacting, in particular different religious traditions coming together? Do you see it that way, or is it more of an indigenous tradition? How would you characterize this particular following?
So the way that I would frame it is that this is the story, this is a study of the interaction or the condition of modernity and colonialism in the post-colony. So the Philippines was colonized by the Spanish for over 300 years and also by the Americans for around 50 years. So this, my understanding of this following and this practice, one might call it syncretic, which is, to think of different religions combining together in different ways. However, the way that I frame it and look at it is to understand, in particular, how colonialism can be seen and understood in terms of how people on the ground live in the Philippines in the 2000s.
Right, right. And we sometimes have trouble, I think, with concepts like you're working with, because we tend to, I mean, we're the postmodern West, we have scientific bent and orientation. So when you start talking about spirits and healing powers, shamans, and Baybaylan, this all sounds very, I guess, different to us. How do you go about talking to students about these concepts and ways that they can understand it without simply dismissing it as superstition or magic or something like that? How would you go about bringing such a subject to the classroom?
Well, the first thing that I talk to people about is when I'm talking about people in the Philippines who practice and believe in these things, I'm often talking about people who use mobile phones, who use computers, who go to medically trained doctors. And so I don't make such a separation between that which is Western and that which is indigenous or might seem strange. We have a saying in anthropology, we make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, right?
Right.
So the idea is that as we spend time in the field, we deconstruct the notions that everything we take on as familiar and comfortable in a long process in and of itself, the things that we might encounter as strange, actually we can see it for their own logics, for their own histories, and for their own, within its own context as working for the people in that particular context. So while bibilans and shamans might seem like strange terminology to people here, our job as anthropologists is to maintain that difference and tell people the story of how that occurs in a wider context.
So you really have to spend some time with your students reconstructing the context and getting them familiar with the context in which that originates, get them out of their own Western perspective and in some ways see this reality from a different worldview, really. Absolutely.
And the first thing I tell people, especially with regards to the Philippines, is that one of the official languages of the Philippines is English. A lot of people there are very familiar with Western culture and pop culture in particular. So this idea that shamanism and bibilism exists there is not to look for something exotic per se, but to look at this is the wholeness of this culture, full of American pop music, full of different kinds of history of American interventionism, and certain kinds of spiritual practices that combine the Catholic traditions, now combining more and more Protestant traditions brought in by Americans. And I'm just interested to see how those things coalesce together. It's not to demarcate that, this is indigenous, this is not. It's not a game of pointing for me. For me, it's about understanding the process and histories by which people make contact with the divine, make contact with their notion of spirits and the ancestors.
Well, I want to pause for a moment and maybe put some illustrations before us here. We've got some images that might help flesh out what you're talking about here. I think we have an image, first off, of a shrine to Santa Regla. And you mentioned kind of a combination of Catholicism, the spirit world, Protestantism. Could you tell us what we're viewing here in this very beautiful picture of a shrine?
So this is an image, yes, this is an image that was taken at the shrine of Santa Regla in Santa Barbara in Iloilo. This is actually from an archived picture, so you can see that the colors are seem exaggerated, but I think it was taken with a point-and-shoot camera. This is a shrine of a church, and at the head of it is an image of Santa Regla. Now, this image was brought to the Philippines from Spain, and what's interesting about it is that it actually is Santa Regla herself was the patron saint of St. Augustine. So she actually originates from North Africa. And what's interesting, I found especially interesting about her, is that she's dark, she's black.
Right.
And the sort of identification I think that colonized peoples had in this region to her, especially during the colonial regime, is that they were looking at a figure that they could somewhat identify with in contrast to the colonizers.
So the image here of Santa Regla with dark skin aided in that process of identification.
To some, yes, to some for sure.
Okay. We have a second image, which is also, I believe, a shrine to Santa Regla, but this time in a private home. Is that correct?
Yes, this is.
Okay. What are we looking at here? This is gorgeous as well.
So this is a private residence in Santa Barbara, and why? So I meticulously attempted to archive and follow her following in Santa Barbara. And what's interesting about this is the family that owned this particular image also was one of the main sponsors behind the image in that church. So actually, as you can see, the architecture of the house and the architecture and the colors of the church are similar to each other. And that's because the family that were considered one of the main followers of Santa Regla built this house by hand and also built the church.
Wow.
So they were architects, they were inventors, and artists.
And I think we have a third image of the exterior of this same house. Is that correct? And,
yes.
In this, you can see, well, I'll let you talk about it, various architectural influences going on here.
Right, yeah. So the exterior of the house is amazing. And what's interesting about it is that it's known as the cake house. It's because it very much looks like a cake. The outside is baby pink and light blues. And the middle section is surrounded by what we call a volada. And the volada is one could call it an indigenous form of architecture that allows for air, and it's kind of like a air conditioning without electricity, because you can open it and allow the wind to come and air to come through and aerate the house. But what's interesting about the house too is that it has influences of Art Deco, it has influences of Indonesian design, it also has influences from native design, which the house that preceded it, or one could say the house that it's based on, is called the Nipa hut. So Nipa huts are architecturally houses that are made from local materials. That would be a new form of architecture that takes on something beyond the Nipa huts, that would, and takes on other kinds of influences, which I've kind of found fascinating.
Well, I found too the existence of this shrine inside a private residence is something we don't often see, but that's not so uncommon in the Roman Catholic world. I understand, but you also said that this house, and I find this interesting, is considered haunted by locals, but that term might mean something different from what we would normally think of in terms of hauntedness.
Yes, absolutely. So why I became interested in this house and the following of Santa Regla within it is I know the people that are own and work in this house. It's actually considered a family ancestral house within my own family.
Oh, okay.
And so why I was interested in it because once I arrived to the town to look at this following, people were telling me, don't live there, I wouldn't go there because we consider it haunted. Now, it was interesting to me, it begged the question for me, what is a haunted house in the post-colony? What is a haunted house in Southeast Asia? Now, the way that they were speaking about it, it's as if a lot of people, they don't believe in ghosts, and yet, there's this kind of, silence around it. And I was interested in that silence. And that silence, as I came to actually live in the house for a while, and I talked to people who knew the family that had lived there for a long time, and I got to interview other people who had said that they were part of the Santa Regla following, is that this house was the center of the following, and that the family had a long history with people in the town which came to have an unsavory sort of, how shall I put it? It became a marked space.
Okay.
It became a marked space because, as you can see, the house is quite decorative. If you look at some of the houses around it, some of them are still nipa huts made from the old bamboo
So
design.
is it marked because it represents a different class, or is that a different economic class, or marked because it's spiritually active, or all of the above?
All
or?
of the above, actually.
Yeah,
That's a good way of putting it, which is to say that the class distinction around that house had to do with that Santa Regla actually, the healer, as I mentioned earlier, not only did she have a healing clinic for various ailments and illnesses and petitions. A lot of people came to her to petition for their child to pass an exam, for example, or to get a job. What I came to understand as I started to talk to more and more people is that she also was an economic advisor, and she began to advise people in different and usually upper middle class groups. And so this practice, a lot of people saw as outside the traditional, or shall we say an ethical role for a Baibalan, right? The accumulation of money. This was something that had not been necessarily part of what a Baibalan does.
You got the Baibalan is usually associated with the spiritual realm, and now you've got this spiritual power being transferred over into the material realm if it's being used to accumulate wealth. Is that the difficulty there?
A lot of the ways that Baibalans were compensated, it's not, you don't become a millionaire by being a Baibalan, historically speaking, but now you have this different sort of phenomenon arising within this town that when I arrived there was largely a rice farming community. And what's interesting is that, and I should have mentioned this to you earlier, is that when I arrived there, not long before, an international airport had been built right outside this town. Now you can imagine a small rice farming community all of a sudden being an international travel hub. And so at this time, when I arrived at this house, the state government, the local government were interested in making this house into a national heritage site. At the same time that people locally were calling it a haunted, cursed place.
That's very interesting. So we've got, I want to look at this very last image here, but we've got the idea that a Baibalan or a shaman in some ways is representative of bringing the spiritual power into the material realm. And oftentimes part of their practice includes the use of herbs, I believe. So the last image shows, if we can get that up, shows us a couple of leaves here. And I'm assuming that this is an herb of some sort that a Baibalan might use. Is that correct? Or?
Yes, yes. So in order for me to understand how Baibalanism or healing practices were in this region, I began to interview several people who were practicing Baibalans. And I would visit their clinics on Tuesdays and Fridays and consult with them, and they were gracious to allow me to sit there and talk with me, and also allow me to sit there as they consulted with their various clients. And so, depending obviously on the petition, right, some of them would recommend various herbs. And so people who use herbs are generally called arbolario. So arbolario were specialists in native plants and herbs to prescribe to people who had certain physical ailments, right? And what's interesting too is a lot of the people who went to them actually couldn't afford to go to hospitals, so they would go to arbolario. And the leaves that you saw there specifically had to do with stomach ailments. So one man showed me the leaf, and then he even took me into the woods to find out where it grew, and then I would follow the client to see, did it work, or how did it work for you, and they kept coming back every week.
Really? Well, you haven't been in this area for long, but there's really a long history in the mountains of North Carolina of traditional types of healing and herb remedies. Maybe not so much anymore, but in the not so distant past. And one of my other guests on this show is actually a Chinese healer who makes potent use of herbs as well. So this seems to be a kind of universal part of healing across cultures.
Right. And, you know, to go back to what you were asking about the indigenous, the idea that you can use plants and local flora and fauna for healing is something that remains as a powerful sort of trope, right? You know, we hear today, you know, you see websites expounding the virtues of this and that herb. And, you know, this is something that isn't, I feel, particularly magical. It just seems to me, I mean, it's magical in the sense that, you know, these plants and herbs do amazing and wonderful things, right? But the fact that these people, Arbulata, are using them, to me is just, I have a friend in the Philippines who is an artist, and his name is Kidlat Tahimik, and he's a filmmaker, and he, instead of using the word indigenous, he likes to use the term indigenous to show the genius of local knowledge and native knowledge.
And if we're not
in any
careful,
place.
we'll lose that if we're not careful.
Right.
I'm glad you used the word magical, because before we leave, I would like to ask you about this fascinating class, Magic with Witchcraft and Religion. What do you do in that class, and how would you distinguish, and maybe you don't, anthropologically speaking, how would you distinguish between magic and witchcraft and religion?
Well, that's a very good question. Generally speaking, the way that I frame the class, I tell them right at the very beginning, and I say, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but I'm just going to be upfront with you. This is not a class on the practice of magic. Sorry. So this is an anthropological take on it. And that is not to say that I say, actually, there is magic in the world. Magic does exist. And one of the examples I use is, if I were to take a dollar bill and I tore it up in front of you, you would probably flip out. And to me, that demonstrates that you actually believe that this piece of paper has some kind of aura and property about it that one should not infringe upon, right? So that's magic to me. That's the magic of the state. So the way that I think about magic is to think about where in generally speaking, Western culture, we have thought about a separation between the supernatural and the so-called supernatural and natural world. And one way that I frame it for students is I take a quote from Sigmund Freud. And Freud, of course, is known more for being the father of psychoanalysis, but he dabbled a lot in anthropological theory, I would say, in his book Totem and Taboo, for example. But one thing I say to the class is, he said once upon a time, I don't believe in ghosts, but I would be afraid of one if I saw it. That kind of paradox, to me, really captures the mode of the class, which is, you know, how does this repression happen? What are the processes, historical process, political and social processes, by which one set of knowledge and one set of practices is categorized as superstition, ghosts, something that is not real, is not something that is considered knowledge, and another set of ideas and practices, mostly encapsulated by science, and rationality is considered knowledge and truth.
So if I'm driving into work one morning and a black cat runs out in front of me, and even if I don't believe it's going to bring me bad luck, the very thought that, when the thought crosses my mind, that's to you evidence that magic really does exist. That we have these touchstones in our lives every day where we bring that into what otherwise would be a very kind of mundane existence.
Perhaps, Freud might call it a latent sort of impulse. One example I thought of is when the Powerball was all the rage here and in other places. I was at a gas station on 421, and I went to go pay for my gas inside. I think I wanted to buy a drink, and I came back out, and all these cars were parked behind me, and there were other pumps that were free. And I asked actually some people, may I ask why you're parked at this particular pump? And they told me it was pump number 7. And they believed it was lucky, and they were going to buy Powerball tickets. So again, it's just interesting to me. People would call it superstitious. To frame it that way is to say then that we make these distinctions between things to believe in and things to not believe in and to repress, which is, again, I find that endlessly fascinating.
Absolutely. And then you make this connection with religion. Do you see religion as a kind of extension of this way of of looking at the world and looking at the sacred intrusion into the profane?
Well, I do. And what's interesting in thinking about shamanism and bibilianism alongside religion, which is to say, historically and traditionally speaking, shamanism is not known to be about organized organization or one prophetic figure per se, right? And religion is more based on institutions and organization and certain figures mediating that relationship with the divine. Shamans work in a different way, which is about mediating a individual's and a smaller community's relationship with the ancestors in the spirit world. And their methods tend to be, one might call, from a religious perspective, one might call it a bit chaotic, unsystematic, but within all that, to me, I'm just endlessly fascinated with the way that humans, whether on an organized level or a more local, individualized level, try to form a relationship with this other space, with
right.
spirits, ghosts, the ancestors, the divine.
That's fascinating. In your work with spirits and bringing it home to the students in a way they can understand, I think is really quite fascinating. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I appreciate you joining us today. This has been very interesting.
Thank you,
Maybe
Ozzie.
having you back sometime.
Thank you. I appreciate
Sure.
that. It's been great to be here.
Thank you. Well, that's Religion and Life for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.